praised him for all that was good, while refusing, all in all, a nice place to be. Now, I just said that there was nothing really remarkable about Vespasian, and that he certainly wasn't on the level of Julius Caesar or Augustus in terms of overall ability. But if there was one realm that he did excel at, it was propaganda and the management of public perception. In this, he was every bit as savvy as the greatest of his predecessors. He was acutely aware of the need to legitimize his reign and restore public respect for imperial authority, which was practically non-existent now after the musical chairs of the previous year. He encouraged the spread of Eastern prophecies that had supposedly foretold his rise to power, and did nothing to dispel rumors that he had miraculously returned sight to a blind man and restored the withered legs of a cripple. Vespasian knew that he was just a man, but it was important for the people to believe that he was perhaps something a bit more. Beyond this subtle mysticism, the iconography of the coins minted during his reign, one of the key vehicles for massaging reality in ancient Rome, harped relentlessly on two themes: peace and victory. Vespasian is the one who brings you peace. Vespasian is the one who will defeat the enemies of peace. These powerfully simple ideas formed the bedrock of the new Flavian administration and helped put the dark days of civil war in the rearview mirror. But Vespasian added one further wrinkle to his propaganda campaign, and it was this final wrinkle that really endeared him to the people. Though he encouraged the belief that he could heal the sick or was an irresistible force destined to rule the empire, when you actually talked to the man, he was refreshingly self-deprecating. He knew he was not descended from some ancient line of nobility. He knew that he was an unrefined rustic, and he knew that he was too old to pretend to be otherwise. When some of his supporters presented him with a family tree that traced his ancestors back to one of the comrades of Hercules, Vespasian simply burst out laughing and sent them on their way. He liked to tell off-color jokes, eat simple foods, and even caused a minor scandal when it got out that he took his own boots off in the evening. Needless to say, after the sometimes waning but usually waxing megalomania of the Julio-Claudians, Vespasian's down-home charm was a welcome change of pace. Of course, we know all of this because, as part of his propaganda campaign, Vespasian also made sure to patronize the heck out of the arts and letters. He put teachers on the public payroll for the first time, and commissioned histories to be written to ensure that the Flavian version of history would become the only version taught. So who knows where fact and fiction diverge, but we do know that Vespasian was the first emperor since Augustus to die of natural causes, so it is not unreasonable to think that he was well regarded in his own time. Ironically though, as much as he sponsored scholars to write glowing histories of his rise to power and what he did when he got there, precious little has actually survived about Vespasian's time as emperor. He was in office from December 69 AD until his death in June of 79, and all we have to draw on to describe that decade are scattered anecdotes. What we do know is that his reign seems to have been focused on physically rebuilding the empire and setting the government back on firm financial footing. To take the latter point first, Vespasian inherited an empty treasury and a shattered tax code and aimed to do something about it. Rome had been grappling with the hangover from Nero's excesses when it had gone and tacked on a year's worth of civil war to the tab. Upon taking office, Vespasian estimated that he would need, quote, 40,000 million sesterces to get the empire back on its feet. Because it is nearly impossible to accurately convert ancient denominations to modern equivalents, we're just going to have to leave that as Vespasian was about to go hunting for an astronomical sum of money. He doubled the tax burden in the provinces, which, yeah, I think everyone saw that coming. But he also engaged in some pretty unseemly business practices that stood as the only real blemish on his record. For example, the emperor didn't think twice about accepting bribes to decide court cases this way or that, and he openly encouraged office seekers to deposit into the imperial treasury an amount that they felt quantified their desire for a given post. Vespasian was also fond of using his agents to corner the market on various scarce goods, and then jacking up the price once a monopoly had been achieved. And in perhaps his most diabolical scheme, the emperor would let loose corrupt tax collectors and look the other way as they extorted the population to their own financial advantage. Then, when the collector had gotten rich enough, Vespasian would suddenly discover their fraud and swoop in to punish the criminal and seize the ill-gotten assets. The pattern repeated itself enough that the people began to refer to these men as Vespasian sponges, who would soak up all the gold before being wrung out by the emperor. He also dreamed up new taxes that hit the usually exempt citizens of Italy. Perhaps the most famous of these was his so-called toilet tax. In ancient Rome, urine was deposited in huge cesspools and then resold by the collectors for a variety of industrial applications. Vespasian imposed a tax on the purchase of said urine, which ignited an outcry that eventually wound its way back to Vespasian by way of his son Titus. Arguing to his father that there was something a bit off about using sewer money, Vespasian smelled the coins Titus had brought along and famously declared that money does not stink, which more or less summed up Vespasian's whole attitude towards revenue generation. But though no one liked how he got the money, Vespasian's reputation did not suffer too much, as he always plowed the profits right back into the empire. Though his infrastructure projects could be seen as an extension of his public relations campaign, there is no denying that both within Rome and out in the provinces, good work was being done to improve the material lives of the citizens. Between the neglect of Nero and the civil wars that followed his death, the Eternal City itself was beginning to look like a crumbling shadow of its former self. Vespasian encouraged the rebuilding of damaged buildings, allowed new owners to take control of forgotten vacant lots, while he himself took the lead in repairing the burned-out Capitol on the abandoned Temple of Claudius. His crowning achievement, though, was his plan for the remains of Nero's Golden Palace. The sprawling complex that had eaten away the heart of the city was dismantled, and in its place, Vespasian ordered the construction of a massive amphitheater. Rising from the drained bed of Nero's old private lake, what became known as simply the Colosseum took shape over the next decade, and though he would not live to see the completion of what the Romans called the Flavian Amphitheater, when the stadium was dedicated by his son Titus in 80 AD, it quickly became one of the most famous architectural achievements in history. But he did not simply focus on Rome itself. Vespasian was quick to send money and resources whenever some region or another was hit with a natural disaster, so that rather than being left to fend for themselves, the victims of floods, fires, and earthquakes found a friend in the emperor. After years of enduring a reclusive and disinterested Tiberius, a megalomaniacal Caligula, an admittedly decent Claudius, but then a cruelly self-absorbed Nero, Vespasian's actions were nothing short of a political and fiscal revolution. For Vespasian, it was an easy call. Using the imperial treasury for the material benefit of the empire conformed with his compassionate nature, but it also conformed with his pragmatic nature, because usually a small investment was all that was required to keep the people happy and paying their taxes. Vespasian's pragmatic compassion extended up and down the social classes and earned him praise from commoner and noble alike. After the chaotic splintering of the upper classes during the civil wars, the ranks of the senatorial and equestrian orders was a confused mess. So Vespasian reorganized the ranks to reflect a post-Year of the Four Emperors reality, but rather than solidifying his rule by executing his enemies and packing the Senate with corrupt supporters, he seems to have followed a program of leaving virtuous men in place and removing the worst of the worst, whoever they had supported during the wars. He even took it a step further by extending financial aid to otherwise worthy senators who had fallen beneath the asset requirements for office. Having stabilized the upper classes, he then took a hands-off approach to their debates and encouraged men to say their piece honestly without fear of imperial reprisal. Vespasian never introduced anything resembling the treason trial so loved by the hypersensitive Julio Claudians, commenting once about a particularly vocal Helvidius Priscus that he would not kill a dog simply for barking. Of course, the irrepressible Priscus had to keep pushing to see just how far he could go, and in 75, Vespasian was forced to banish him from Rome. Eventually, the dissident Stoic would be executed by Titus, but he was a particularly troubling pain in the rear end, and definitely the exception rather than the rule. Vespasian's decade in office is usually understood to have been one of peace at home and abroad. Certainly, the coins he minted drove home the idea that all was well and the empire was at peace. But in reality, in the beginning anyway, Vespasian could not escape the entropy that always pulls at the edges of empire. In Judea, the revolt Vespasian had been assigned to put down did not stop simply because he had turned his attention westward. In fact, with the Roman world in crisis, Jewish leaders redoubled their efforts, believing that now was the perfect time to drive off the distracted legions. But unfortunately for the Jews, Rome was more than able to walk and chew gum at the same time. Vespasian assigned his more than capable son Titus to take over operations in Judea, and in 70 AD, just months after his father became emperor, Titus began the final siege of Jerusalem. Surrounding the city with his 4 legions, Titus cut off supplies going into the city, and then opened negotiations for a peaceful surrender. But the scene inside of Jerusalem was ugly. The Jewish leadership was fractured, and infighting between the moderate and extreme elements led to a toxic atmosphere of mutual assassination and terrorist attacks. At one point, the food stores were torched by hardline anti-Romans who believed the loss of their security blanket would force the moderates to fight to the death. By May, Titus was done talking and crashed through one of the outer walls. Intense street fighting followed, with the Jews left alive falling behind the secondary walls near the Temple Mount. But the Romans finally overcame these last defenders, and by September, the entire city was in their hands. History records that at this point, the Roman soldiers, enraged at the ordeal the Jews had just put them through, plundered the city mercilessly and set fire to the rest, including, against Titus's explicit orders, the great temple itself. Josephus, who was present with Titus at the time, reports that over the course of the siege, over 1 million people died, and another 100,000 were taken prisoner. The great Jewish revolt was broken. However, a few pockets of resistance still existed, and after Titus was recalled to Rome to serve as his father's colleague, a deputy was put in charge of mop-up duties. The most famous of these pockets was of course the fortress at Masada, garrisoned by 960 Sicarii fighters. The fortress, situated atop a high mesa, was nearly impregnable, and it took a full year's worth of rampart building for the Romans to even reach the walls. On April 16, 73 AD, though, the Romans finally broke down the gate with a battering ram, and, to their surprise, found the entire population of Masada dead from an apparent mass murder-suicide pact to avoid capture and slavery. The siege of Masada quickly entered into the Jewish collective consciousness and has held a prominent place there ever since. Today, beyond its popularity as a tourist destination, the Israeli Defense Force holds its basic training graduation at the ruins of the fortress, where their newly inducted soldiers swear to never allow Masada to fall again. On the other side of the empire, Vespasian inherited a short-lived, but arguably more serious revolt in Gaul. When Vitellius decided to use the soldiers under his command to invade Italy, he left the Rhine River severely undermanned, and local tribal leaders were not about to miss their opportunity. Specifically, a hereditary prince of the Batavians named Julius Civilis, who had been made a citizen of Rome previously as a reward for 25 years' service in the Legion, decided that he had had enough of the